My own mother left me alone at the airport when I was just 15, so she could enjoy a luxury vacation with her new husband and his kids. "You'll figure it out," she said with a careless shrug before walking away. So I did figure it out. I called my estranged father for help. A few hours later, he arrived in a private jet and took me with him. When my mother finally came back from her trip, she found my room empty and a legal notice waiting for her. My name is Blanche, and I was only 15 years old when my mother abandoned me at the airport. I still remember the casual, cold shrug she gave as she handed me $200 and walked away to start a new life with her wealthy husband and his children. That moment at Gate 24 shattered every single thing I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and love. What I never could have expected was how that devastating betrayal would lead me to the hidden truth about my past and change my life forever. Before I tell you how I went from being a discarded teenager at a boarding gate to finding my true family, you need to hear what happened when my mother eventually returned to find my room completely empty. My early childhood memories were actually quite happy. I remember weekend trips to the local park where my mother would push me on the swings until my stomach fluttered with pure excitement. On my 6th birthday, she baked a lopsided chocolate cake and decorated our tiny apartment with handmade paper streamers. We did not have much back then, but we had each other, and that felt like it was more than enough. Everything changed when I was 8. I came home from school one afternoon to find my parents sitting stiffly on opposite ends of our worn-out couch. The air in the room felt heavy with a tension I did not understand as they explained they were getting a divorce. The explanation was minimal, just a generic statement about how sometimes adults stop loving each other, which left me with more questions than answers. I remember crying myself to sleep that night, clutching my stuffed rabbit as the muffled sounds of their final arguments filtered through my bedroom wall. My mother received primary custody, and my father quickly faded from my life. Our weekends together dwindled from every other week to once a month, then to occasional phone calls that became increasingly awkward and brief. By the time I was 10, he was little more than a name on my birth certificate and a fading memory. Life in a single-parent household was a struggle. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, waitressing during the day and cleaning office buildings at night. I became accustomed to microwave dinners and letting myself into our apartment with a key I wore on a string around my neck. Despite the financial struggles, there was a certain stability in our routine. I understood the rules and I never doubted that I was the center of my mother's world. When I was 13, things shifted again. My mother met a man named Richard at the restaurant where she worked. He was a wealthy businessman who left extravagant tips and specifically asked for her section whenever he dined there. I still remember the first time she mentioned him, her cheeks flushed with excitement as she described his expensive suit and the way he looked at her like she was someone special. Their romance progressed with whirlwind speed. Within 6 months, Richard had proposed with a diamond ring so large it looked comically out of place on my mother's work-worn hand. Before I even had time to adjust to the idea of having a stepfather, we were moving into a sprawling suburban mansion, complete with a pool, a home theater, and more bathrooms than I could count. The house came with 3 other residents, Richard's children from his previous marriage. Olivia was 14, just a year older than me, with a perpetual look of disdain that made me feel instantly inferior. Jackson was 12, quiet and withdrawn, barely acknowledging my existence. The youngest, Zoe, was 10 and initially the most welcoming, though that friendliness quickly faded once we were all living under the same roof. From the very beginning, it was clear that I did not fit into this ready-made family. Richard was polite but distant, reserving his genuine smiles and affection for his own children. Family dinners became exercises in deep discomfort as Richard and my mother discussed private schools, country club memberships, and vacation homes. These were topics from a world I had never been part of. Whenever I spoke, my comments about school or books were met with polite nods before the conversation shifted back to the stepchildren's accomplishments in tennis, debate club, or piano. What hurt most was watching my mother transform. The woman who had once cut coupons and shopped clearance racks now spoke knowledgeably about designer brands and exclusive restaurants. She colored her hair, whitened her teeth, and began referring to our previous life as the struggle years with an uncomfortable laugh whenever Richard's friends were around. It was as if she was shedding her old skin and, along with it, the parts of herself connected to me. I tried desperately to fit in with my new step-siblings. I offered to help Olivia with her math, complimented Zoe's artwork, and asked Jackson about his video games. My attempts were met with cool politeness at best and outright rejection at worst. One particularly painful memory was overhearing Olivia tell her friends on the phone that her dad's new wife came with baggage, and she was talking about me. As summer approached, Richard announced a family vacation to Bali. It was to be 2 weeks at an exclusive resort with private villas and personal butlers. Despite the growing distance between my mother and me, I felt a surge of excitement. I thought perhaps this trip would be a chance to finally bond with my new family away from the pressures of everyday life. My hopes were quickly dampened when my mother took the stepchildren shopping for new vacation clothes, but did not include me. When I asked why, she casually mentioned that I had plenty of clothes already. Despite the fact that most of mine were from our life before Richard, I ended up using the money I had saved from babysitting to buy myself a new swimsuit, a modest blue one-piece that paled in comparison to the designer bikinis Olivia and Zoe would be bringing. A week before the trip, I overheard a concerning conversation between my mother and Richard. They were in their bedroom with the door slightly ajar. Richard asked about the arrangements for Blanche in a low voice. My mother replied with a dismissive tone that made my stomach clench, saying it was all taken care of and that I would not be a problem. When I questioned her about it later, she brushed off my concerns with a breezy comment about trip details and told me not to worry. The morning of our departure arrived with chaos and excitement. The house was a flurry of activity as suitcases were loaded into Richard's luxury SUV. I noticed that my passport was not with a stack of travel documents on the kitchen counter, but when I mentioned this to my mother, she muttered something about having it in her purse and hurried me along. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. I should have noticed the way my mother avoided eye contact as we drove to the airport, or how no one discussed my seating assignment on the plane. Even the fact that my suitcase was mysteriously smaller than everyone else's should have tipped me off. But at 15, I was desperate to believe I was part of this family, so I ignored the warning bells. The international terminal was a chaotic maze. Richard led our group through the crowd with practiced efficiency, my mother at his side clutching her designer handbag. Olivia, Jackson, and Zoe followed closely behind, their faces bright with anticipation. I trailed at the back, struggling to keep up while rolling my small suitcase. When we reached the check-in counter, Richard presented the passports. I noticed he handed over 5 passports, not 6. A knot formed in my stomach as I watched boarding passes being distributed to everyone except me. When I stepped forward to ask about mine, the attendant said there were only 5 passengers listed. Richard cleared his throat and told me my mother needed to speak with me about that, and then he took his children toward security. My mother took my elbow and guided me to a quiet corner. Her face wore an expression of detachment and mild annoyance. She told me there had been a change of plans and that I was not coming to Bali. The words hit me like a physical blow. When I asked what I had done wrong, she sighed and looked toward Richard and the children. She said Richard thought the trip should just be for him and his kids to bond as a family. I protested, crying that I was her daughter, but she hissed at me not to make a scene. She pulled out $200, pressed it into my hand, and told me to take an Uber home. I stared at the money in disbelief, realizing she was leaving me at the airport alone without even a house key. She gave a casual shrug and said the neighbor had a spare. She told me I was mature for my age and that this vacation was important for her future. She called my abandonment a sacrifice. When I got angry, she told me not to be dramatic and mentioned there was food in the fridge and pizza money in a drawer. She leaned in, gave me a quick, dry kiss on the forehead, and walked away. Her heels clicked on the tile as she rejoined her new family, never once looking back. I stood rooted to the spot as they disappeared through security. I spent the next hour in a daze, watching the departure board until their flight was gone. I tried calling her repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted her asking if abandoning her child was worth a first-class upgrade, but there was no response. As the evening went on, an airport security officer approached me because I had been there for hours. I lied and said I was waiting for a ride. I felt a wave of humiliation, unable to admit my own mother had dumped me there. By 8 p.m., I went to an airport restaurant and ordered fries just to have a place to sit. A kind server named Gloria saw I had been crying and brought me a milkshake on the house. Her small kindness nearly broke me. I started scrolling through my phone contacts, looking for anyone who could help. Most of my old friends were gone. I tried my mother's friends, but they didn't answer or were out of town. Finally, a name caught my eye: Dad. I hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. My mother always told me he had moved on and wasn't cut out for parenthood. Despite my fear of another rejection, I called him. When he answered, I broke down and told him everything. His voice turned hard when he realized what had happened. He didn't hesitate. He told me he was coming to get me himself and that it would take him 3 hours. He told me to go to the airline's customer service desk and wait there. The airline staff were sympathetic and took me to a private area. They told me that this happens more often than people think. After a long, anxious wait, my name was called over the PA system. I was escorted not to the main terminal, but to a private section leading to the tarmac. That was when I saw it, a sleek private jet. Walking down the stairs was my father. He looked different, more successful and confident, but his eyes were still kind. He strode forward and told me he couldn't believe it was really me. He apologized for not being there and for not fighting harder. When I told him my mother said he didn't want to see me, his face darkened. He said that was never true. He guided me onto the jet, which was filled with leather and polished wood. He explained that he was now the CEO of a company called Horizon Tech. He told me he had been trying to reach me for years with cards and gifts, but my mother had hidden them. He had even hired investigators, but couldn't find our new address. He revealed that he had been sending plenty of child support and extra money every month since the divorce, money I never saw while we were living on ramen noodles. He opened a folder and showed me the proof, canceled checks and legal documents showing his desperate attempts to reach me. The evidence in that folder was overwhelming, a meticulously organized timeline of my father's desperate attempts to reach me. As the private jet climbed higher into the clouds, leaving the terminal where I had been discarded like unwanted luggage, I felt a strange sense of weightlessness. It was as if I were finally shedding years of manipulation and lies with every mile we traveled. My father explained that he had moved to Seattle after the divorce to build a tech startup. That small venture had eventually blossomed into Horizon Tech, a major industry leader, bringing him a level of success he had never imagined. He looked at me with a touch of sheepishness and admitted he had kept a room ready for me all those years, just in case I ever found my way back to him. The flight became a delicate bridge between our past and our future. We navigated awkward silences and sudden bursts of emotion, but a genuine connection, one that felt both brand new and ancient, began to take root. When we landed, a car whisked us through upscale neighborhoods to a modern masterpiece of glass and stone perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. My father welcomed me home with a mix of pride and visible nerves, hoping I would be comfortable in such a different environment. A woman named Linda, my father's executive assistant, met us at the door. She had already prepared everything, from fresh towels to a kitchen stocked with my favorite foods, and ensured the security team knew I was now a permanent member of the household. When my father led me to my new bedroom, I stopped dead in the tracks. It was a beautiful space painted in soft blues with massive windows facing the water, featuring a plush bed and a perfect study nook. But it was the dresser that broke my heart. It was covered in gifts, birthday, and Christmas presents from every single year we were apart, still in their original wrapping. He had bought them religiously, unable to deliver them but unable to stop being my father. Beside them was a photo album titled Blanche, filled with the few traces of my life he had been able to scavenge: school pictures, a newspaper clipping of an academic award, and even a blurry long-distance photo of me leaving school. I whispered that he really had tried, and he promised he wasn't going anywhere ever again. That first night, we shared a quiet meal, and I felt truly seen for the first time in years. As I sank into the impossibly soft sheets of my new bed, my last thought was that being abandoned at Gate 24 wasn't the tragedy I thought it was the rescue I had always needed. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of waves and the smell of breakfast. I found my father in the kitchen struggling with pancakes. He looked so much like the man from my childhood, trying to make smiley faces out of chocolate chips, just like he used to do on Sunday mornings. The normalcy of that breakfast helped wash away the lingering bitterness of the airport. Later that day, I met Judith Bennett, a distinguished family law attorney. She was professional but kind as she explained that my mother's actions constituted legal abandonment. She also pointed out the clear financial misconduct regarding the child support my father had been paying faithfully for years. While I didn't want to cause trouble, I knew I needed legal protection to stay where I was finally wanted. My father made it clear the choice was mine, but he was ready to fight for full custody. He showed me his office, which was a vault of evidence, court filings, unanswered call logs, and emails to my school that my mother had somehow blocked. She had even sent legal threats claiming he was harassing us, all to maintain the lie that he didn't care. 2 days later, my mother finally called. I stared at the screen, paralyzed, until it went to voicemail. We played the message on speaker. Her voice was falsely bright, claiming there had been a terrible misunderstanding and that she had merely wanted me to have some independence while they were in Bali. She called the word abandonment harsh and told me she loved me. The blatant gaslighting made my stomach churn. There had never been a plan for me to stay behind. With my father and Judith by my side, I made the firm decision to remain in Seattle. My father immediately took me shopping for things I actually needed: clothes that fit, a laptop for school, and a phone plan that wasn't restricted. It was a world away from the thrift stores and clearance racks of my life with Richard. As the days passed, we talked deeply about the divorce. My father explained that my mother valued social status and financial security above all else, and when his first business failed, she saw him as a disappointment rather than a partner. She had used her custody as a weapon to cut him out. Now, we were looking forward. He arranged for me to attend a top-tier private school and found a psychologist to help me process the trauma of the past few years. But there was one thing left to do. A week after I arrived, my father and Judith suggested we retrieve my belongings from my mother's house while she was still in Bali. It was a chance to close the door on that life without a confrontation. Returning to that house felt like entering a tomb. It was silent and cold. Looking at the photos on the walls, I realized I was barely in any of them. The frames were filled with Richard and his children. My father's face fell when he saw my tiny, impersonal room at the far end of the hall, so different from the indulgent suites of my step-siblings. He told me I deserved better, and for the first time, I believed him. As the movers packed my things, I was selective, leaving behind anything bought by Richard or my mother. While clearing out my desk, I found a hidden box of keepsakes, old photos, and a teddy bear my father gave me when I was 5. Then, behind a row of shoes in the closet, I found the ultimate betrayal. It was a stack of envelopes bound by a rubber band, all in my father's handwriting. I opened a card from my 13th birthday, then another, then a letter with his Seattle address and phone number. She had intercepted and hidden every single attempt he made to be in my life. I stood there with tears streaming down my face, realizing I had spent years feeling forgotten while my father's love was sitting in the back of a dark closet. He pulled me into a tight embrace, promising that the days of being separated by lies were finally over. Searching through my mother's filing cabinet, I discovered that the truth was even darker than I had imagined. In a folder labeled divorce, I found financial records that proved my father had been sending monthly child support payments far larger than what my mother ever claimed. This money had been deposited regularly into an account I never knew existed while we lived on the bare minimum. Even more devastating were the court documents showing his repeated, desperate petitions for visitation, all of which my mother had blocked with fabricated excuses. Most damning of all was a draft of a letter she had written to her attorney around the time she met Richard. In it, she outlined a cold strategy to minimize my father's influence so she could integrate into Richard's life without a hitch. She referred to me as a complication that needed to be managed carefully to ensure Richard stayed interested in her. By late afternoon, my room was empty and the packing was complete. I sat at my bare desk and wrote a final letter. I started it with "Dear Mom," because Mother felt too distant and Mommy was a warmth I could no longer reach. I poured out years of feeling like an inconvenience and told her I had found the hidden letters and the financial records. I told her I knew about her systematic campaign to erase my father. "I am choosing to live with Dad now," I wrote. I explained it wasn't out of revenge, but because I deserved to be somewhere I was actually valued. I told her I didn't hate her, but I finally loved myself enough to leave. I placed the letter and my house key on the strip mattress of my bed and walked out of that house for the last time. As we drove away, I didn't look back. I only looked toward the future. 3 days later, my mother returned from Bali, and my phone exploded with a barrage of frantic messages. They cycled from anger to manipulation to false guilt in a predictable pattern. She went from demanding I come home to accusing me of being cruel. After everything she had done for me. A week later, she showed up unannounced at my father's gates in her luxury SUV. I decided to face her, but only with my father and Judith by my side. When she saw me, she tried to act relieved, but the moment I stepped back from her embrace, her facade cracked. She immediately accused my father of luring me away with luxury, but I cut her off. I told her I was there because she abandoned me at an airport and because I found the years of letters she had stolen from me. Her reaction was to snap that everything under her roof belonged to her, including my mail, and she claimed she was protecting me from my father's inconsistency. My father finally spoke up, telling her there were no broken promises, only her efforts to erase him. She hissed that he had no idea what raising me alone was like, but he reminded her of the thousands of dollars he sent every month that she had clearly spent on herself. She eventually crumbled, admitting that Richard had thought it would be better if I stayed home because the resort was for adults and his children who were used to that lifestyle. She admitted she was afraid of losing him, so she chose her financial security over her own daughter. Before the conversation could go further, Richard himself strode in and ordered her to the car like a child. As she walked away, following his command, I realized I was no longer the one being left behind. In the months that followed, my father's legal team secured a restraining order against Richard and temporary custody for my father. I began seeing a therapist, Dr. Eleanor Wilson, who helped me understand that my mother's actions were a reflection of her own brokenness, not my worth. She taught me that people who are whole do not abandon their children. My father enrolled me in Westlake Academy, where for the first time in years, I made genuine friends who didn't have an agenda. Building a relationship with my father was a delicate dance of rediscovering the man who used to stargaze with me. We couldn't get back the years of middle school or first crushes he had missed, but we had the present. 6 months later, the court granted my father full legal custody. The judge ordered my mother to repay the stolen child support and mandated joint therapy sessions. Those sessions were excruciating, as my mother continued to frame her abandonment as a misguided attempt to please Richard. I had to set firm boundaries. I would never move back, and I would never let her rewrite history to ease her guilt. My father never spoke ill of her during this time, telling me that hating her would only hurt me, as I was half her. He told me that because she gave him me, he could forgive almost anything. That first holiday season with my father's extended family was a revelation of true warmth, a stark contrast to the performative dinners at Richard's mansion. I graduated high school as valedictorian 3 years later, with my father beaming in the front row and my mother sitting awkwardly behind him. I went on to the East Coast to study psychology and family law, eventually building a career developing programs for family courts to ensure other children's needs were prioritized during custody battles. The journey to forgiveness was not linear. Some days the memory of that shrug at gate 24 still took my breath away, but other days I could look at her with compassion for her limitations. On my 20th birthday, I wrote her a letter telling her I realized she could only give what she had within herself, and I was finally free from expecting what she could never provide. When I got married at 28, my father walked me down the aisle, whispering how happy he was to see me whole. My mother was there, too, now divorced from Richard. She stayed in the background, finally showing the restraint to let me be the woman I had become without claiming credit for it. As I started my own family, I used my parents as a roadmap, emulating my father's persistence and learning from my mother's mistakes about status and connection. The airport abandonment didn't define me. It was just the pivot point that forced me to find my own voice. Families aren't just about biology. They're about the consistent choice to show up for one another. My father taught me that, and my mother, in her absence, confirmed it. If you have ever felt abandoned, remember that their failure is not your destiny. Take care. Thanks for watching.